Alright, let's get into this. I took all my notes while playing Chapter 1 of the award-winning television series Project Eden's Garden, so I kind of just have a long stream of consciousness here. I'm going to section my notes and opinions into chunks as best I can, starting with simple or objective negatives, then moving on to subjective negatives, then moving on to the positives. To reiterate what I said in my video way back when in the prologue, I don't really like most fangans. I like them as a concept for the creators. I just don't think they make good products for an external audience. I say products, understanding they're not paid. That's not what I'm saying. But I just find this one's development process compelling enough to do all this, given my full attention, and I wanted to see it succeed and support it as an honest critic. The fact that the massive workload and the directional challenge this must have been to create even only up to this point is a given, and I have nothing but admiration for the team involved. I simply prefer to communicate my thoughts on media through criticism, and they can make their own decisions on how to interpret this criticism. To start with, I'll just hit up straight up bugs and game quality stuff. For one, there's a consistent issue with number key menus, where if you are in a dialogue, if you pull up a menu, and then, let's say the control menu, then you close that menu, you are locked out of opening up any other menu until you advance to the next dialogue. A version of this can happen in the trial when the timer runs down. It ran down for me while I was taking notes at a certain point when it's asking me to select a piece of evidence. So then I loaded back after the timer ran down, and the menu was non-functional and no inputs would do anything, so I had to manually close the game and start from the last save point. Sometimes the game flashes back a few times within the span of half a second. I'm not entirely sure why. That might not even be the game, but that could be my computer in some way or another, because I haven't seen that happen to anyone else. At one point, the map during free time told me Kai was in a certain position, but he literally wasn't actually there. I think that's because if you talk to a character and then say no to them at a certain point for whether or not you want to do an FTE with them, I think if you go out of the zone, they disappear. Maybe, I guess. I'd prefer if the game also gave me a warning before clicking on Damon's room during free time. I clicked on Damon's room to see if I could get Kai to load back into existence after changing areas, and it immediately sacrificed my free time. The same should also be true of giving you a warning before doing something. Probably be true of Pachinko, especially because the gacha and the Pachinko use the same menu. And it was not just me. I saw countless people accidentally throwing away all of their coins or a huge number of coins in a single gacha pull because they meant to put it into the Pachinko machine. The way the game is currently designed makes this basically meaningless, but also the balancing for how more coins can increase your odds of getting something new is completely detached. You can put 1,000 coins in and still have much lower odds of getting the last one or two items from the gachapon than if you used a single coin at a time and just did 50 pulls. Oftentimes in the trial, the evidence menu will glitch out and the menu's camera will be in a previous position, but the current menu selection will always start at the top of the list. So it won't line up with the camera view until you scroll down to the bottom again. This also happens, for instance, if I were to open up a menu and then scroll all the way down, then exit, go to, say, the options menu, which doesn't scroll very far. The camera will be way lower than it's supposed to be. I also don't think the evidence should be in, faux alphabetical order. It's weird because not everything is in alphabetical order, but most of it is, and it's clearly not in acquisition order, which I think acquisition order would just be better, so that you know where to find the pieces of evidence in your menu. I think any game with visual novel or adventure game mechanics should at least have a fast-forward button for dialogue and scenes, especially a game that's liable to have bugs that sometimes force you to restart the whole program. And I think fast-forwarding during non-stop debates should be way faster than it currently is. On the topic of speed, as a visual novel, you should also be able to increase the text display speed to be a lot faster than the current maximum is. Most VNs let you max it out to have text instantly display in full. I just prefer extremely fast text to the point of displaying almost the full text box within a quarter of a second, say. For general game speed, I think the little animation fade-ins that play whenever you make any screen transition, you know, you're in the 3D environment, you click on anything, you click on a thing to look at, you click on a character, the transition to looking at that and opening up the first dialogue is too long. I would like it to be at least 2 times faster to get to the first text box from that interaction. It's like, you know how game designers, they talk about how much time Nintendo put into perfecting Mario's jump in the original Mario games? Because you're going to be jumping a lot. It's the core aspect of the game, so it matters that it feels as good as possible. Game feel. It's the same for any game. Any piece of interactivity the player has, you want it to feel good for the player, with the right feedback, the right timing. So having these fade-ins, these lengthy fade-ins to interact with something that just take a little too long, they feel needlessly sluggish. And if they felt better, it would drastically improve the overall game feel. I'd also like to be able to skip cutscenes, and any, like, you know, otherwise unskippable animations. For instance, like in Tozu Theater, it's very obvious if you're clicking through all the dialogue to get through it, that there's lots of his transitions while he's talking that are just, like, constantly bogged down, and you can't fast speed them up in any way. And for the boss fight at the end of the trial, the bullet patterns seem to often spawn in ways that overlap and leave you no room to avoid getting hit, sometimes for very inconsistent high amounts of damage. I also find the controls a bit strange for keyboard, because why is shooting the bullet the F key? Why isn't it the right mouse click like it is usually in the rest of the trial? There's no reason not to have it be right mouse click. In terms of gameplay in the form of puzzle logic and story logic, I think some visualizations at certain points would be helpful. A lot of characters describe things using these vague terms that I can't visualize. When they start talking about, for instance, lithium batteries, I do not have a concept of what size, shape, weight of object they're exactly talking about. I mean, I can look up a bunch of different kinds of lithium batteries, but in my head, I'm thinking like a laptop battery. Like the size of an especially thick eraser. But then they claim that Diana claims that she couldn't have just chucked up a battery across the room with only one arm. A small room with only one arm, or throw it with her otherwise injured arm, which I find unreasonable, even if we're talking about something as heavy as a car battery. I'm not trying to nitpick the logic of the mystery just yet in this part, but just some context about the size and shape and weight of the fucking thing that we're talking about would at least help make things clearer, whether they logically add up or not. There's lots of parts where the characters are talking very confidently as though they can envision a scene, but they're using these vague phrases that I don't think properly explain what it is that I'm supposed to be imagining. Like they're talking about if a vent opens a certain way, or if something can fit through the grates in the vent, and I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, you talking as if you can see it. I can't see it. I'm not familiar with a vent in real life that is so heavy that it requires a lot of pressure and force to move that is attached via a hinge? A hinge for some reason, even though I've never seen a vent door on hinges in real life, and the vent door is connected via hinge to the floor of the vent instead of like the ceiling or the side or something, which is very weird. So this is a really weird thing that you're describing. So could I see it visually? And some of the shots it requires you to do in non-stop debates in particular, like I recall one in which I was fairly sure that the mystery was already going in a direction where some mechanism or something that came from the vents that connect to the dining hall were going to be involved, and yet a weird selection of contradiction points to shoot. Like, it wanted me to say that the battery could have quote-unquote fallen from the generator, which, like, there's no more reason to say the generator versus any other object that's nearby in the vicinity. Like, there's pipes on the wall, which could have also been looped in. There's no reason not to, like, there's lots of things that technically something could have been dangling from nearby, and it's not even really from the top of the generator, because it's connected to the vent. That's the important thing, and that's the thing that, like, is obviously going to the direction. It has nothing to do with the generator. So if the generator was somewhere else, the battery would have just been hanging from the vent against the wall, and it would have been the same scenario. So, like, I don't agree with the logic of the fact that wanted me to use that truth bullet on that thing in that way. Okay, that out of the way, on to nitpicking mystery plot-related stuff because it's fresh in my mind. It's kind of weird to me that the basement and the dining hall are so close in proximity, and yet the people in the dining hall didn't hear Wolfgang screaming like a fucking lunatic because they had music on, which must have been really loud to drown out yelling so that no one would even notice or so much as glance in that direction. And for Diana, in the basement, not that it really matters, but if that music was playing that loudly, she would have probably heard them blasting shitty Smash Bros. Music through the vent. And I don't understand the point of drugging Wolfgang. It doesn't seem like anything in the murder, as a plan, required Wolfgang to be awake at all or do anything, and it also seems like a risky plan to frame someone who was conscious through the whole thing and could remark on the circumstances of Wolfgang's death to the others, if questioned about it. If she even glanced upwards towards the vent at which the loud music would have been blasting from, she would have seen the makeshift contraption, and thus at least be able to provide context that would have helped the others identify what mechanism was used. I'm sure that the excuse that they want you to accept is that the hallucinogenic drug was used to make Wolfgang attack Diana and thus hopefully incentivize Diana to attack Wolfgang with the provided taser, which is weird because it's like a dark, dim, cluttered basement, and it's assuming that she somehow saw a random taser placed in this shitty, poorly lit basement, shoot it at him, not notice that it doesn't actually fire, and then somehow think that she killed Wolfgang herself, despite the fact that a taser would not kill someone just because they're in water. And also, how would that make the generator explode? Or how is she supposed to believe that that made the generator explode? And also, if it was meant to make Diana think that she fired a taser that killed Wolfgang, obviously she knows someone else locked her in the room, so there's no logical reason for her to assume that she herself was the actual culprit, since she was clearly set up, the taser was provided by someone, the door was locked by someone. Also, Ava just somehow knew exactly how long Wolfgang would be knocked out for to time it perfectly for Diana's arrival. Mind you, this whole plan was set up more than 2 days ago, because Diana received her note telling her where and when to go 2 days before. So the timing, all of that had been pre-planned 2 days ago. And Ava also could identify a hallucinogenic that would make Wolfgang violent in such a way as to prompt Diana into using a taser that she was somehow supposed to see, but not energetic enough for him to climb out of knee-deep water. My point is that the drugging part of it is completely pointless and nonsensical, and none of this is plausible validation for anyone's concerns about the pharmacy, and the only reason that it was put in the story is obviously to try to validate this dumb fucking thing that Damon and the others were suggesting, that the pharmacy is somehow dangerous. Oh, because a drug was used in a really weird and pointless way in a tiny part of this convoluted scheme. Also, she could have killed Wolfgang at any time, and Tozu could have just covered up the time of death in the autopsy report, right? Like her plan, it's weird because Ava and Tozu were already collaborating on some level in that she was provided this perk, but also, Tozu could control whether or not it made a real difference or was important. He could control whether or not to include the time of death in the autopsy report itself. And it seems to me like there probably should have been ways for any character to have set up any sort of time delay if all it takes is dropping a battery into some water for it to explode. Just use a fuse with a mosquito coil and then it falls from a rope into the water or something. I mean, the murder plan doesn't really have any goals to begin with. For one, Ava didn't actually pin anything on Diana, because the only reason Diana had suspicion thrown towards her was because, by sheer happenstance, every single other character in the game happened to have an alibi at that exact time, except for her. In Ava's original plan, Diana would have been locked in the room from the inside forever, and it would have been a locked room mystery, because there'd been no escape. But it would obviously be really weird that once they open the door and find Diana still in there, that the supposed killer somehow locked themselves in a room for a door that had to have literally been mechanically changed in order to lock from the outside. I'm not saying that it's like a plot hole that a character made a stupid murder plan. The original series is filled with tons of dumb murder plans, but I still don't even, in theory, understand what the point of drugging Wolfgang is. And if he freaked out and left the water, the game is kind of saying that he wouldn't have died if he just got out of the water. We're not told what other drugs they had access to, but I'm assuming anything that just keeps him knocks out or at least sedated would have been fine. I don't really think that electricity works like that, for one. Like, okay, batteries. Lithium inside is what reacts to water. To make it explode, a normal battery, to make it explode, you generally have to remove all of the safety wrapping outside of the battery first and toss, like, the lithium part of it inside straight into the water. Now, that does not explode immediately. It starts to chemically react, it starts generating heat, then it generates enough heat to light on fire, and then it eventually makes, like, a small explosion. The explosion is small, and most importantly, the explosion does not generate electricity. You can't just throw a battery into some water and have it generate electricity. Water doesn't even really pure water doesn't conduct electricity. It's just the minerals and, like, the sodium in the water. So, ocean water is pretty conductive, and particularly conductive water could make skin, if it's on skin, slightly more conductive, but there's no way for it to turn a taser into a lethal weapon, nor should anyone really think that a taser could be a lethal weapon if someone's just in water. The fact that anyone even suggested that a taser could have been the murder weapon is deeply insane. Let's see. I also find it weird that the door locks automatically when it's closed, and that Diana would have closed the door before seeing what was inside the room. Like, this is not a large room. As far as we can tell, if we're meant to visually, like judge... We see the 3D space. We play in 3D space. It's a very small room. So she would have seen Wolfgang there before she even entered the room. So it's weird that she still closed, you know... And when they were investigating the crime scene, the door did not lock automatically when it was closed and thus require help from the outside of the room every single time they closed it in order to open it back up. So I'm not sure if I understand how it locked Diana in there just by it closing. Also, if the vents are so tough to open that Damon had to exert a significant physical effort with both of his arms and his upper body strength to move one of the vents, and its resistance to being closed by holding up the weight of a battery, which we are told is so heavy that Diana could not have reasonably tossed it a few meters away with a single arm, then I find it a little implausible that Ava could apply enough force to the vent grate to move it with just one arm awkwardly dangling over the back side of a reclining armchair. Diana was still awake after Wolfgang died and the power went out, and the music had obviously stopped playing by then because of the power outage, but she did not yell or say anything that would have been heard by the others once there was no longer the masking noise of the music. I'm a little confused as to whether or not Diana was briefly unconscious after the explosion, but I just find this a little strange. Beyond that, I just take some issue with what the characters insist is or is not conclusive evidence of whatever, or some of the things that they assume with great confidence. Like, I don't think the evidence really proves what actually happened by itself without a lot of assumptions involved, especially since even in the canon, none of the characters can confirm what these batteries even look like, and also I guess we're supposed to believe Desmond that he did not know about the guns in his own room. I thought we would come back to that point, but they never did. And lastly, but significantly, a 4-digit PIN code in the pharmacy door, a 4-digit PIN code can easily be brute forced in like an hour. Unless there's some big arbitrary time delay between attempts, or the console is gonna lock if you guess wrong too many times, it would be really easy to just go from 0000 through 9999. They say it would take days to brute force. That is simply incorrect and insane. That is nonsense. Just a small rewrite to make some reason why they can't just brute force it and just enter 1 through 99 would fix this narrative problem. And lastly, the building layout makes no sense. Like, what building would be constructed like this? What's occupying all this space in the middle where there's no rooms? Why do the hallways have, like, these extra corners? Anyways, all things together, let me think about the chapter as a whole. One thing that's related to the class trial and the mystery-solving elements is the number of times that it was painfully obvious that an aside detail was happening because it was going to be plot relevant later on. Like when they spend several lines randomly extending a conversation by talking about lithium batteries in a way that's not interesting or entertaining by itself. A big issue I have with the whole world and characters and dialogue is that nobody ever sits down as a group and, like, talked about their situation. The first morning, after being kidnapped and forced to stay the night here, and they only meet, and they say, "The janitor's closet is locked. A new gate is open. Let's go explore it." They never had a serious conversation about what's going on, what they wanted to do, checking in with each other, anything. I assume that not including scenes like this is because a lot of death games and a lot of fangans have a lot of basically identical scenes covering the same information that just get really boring after a while. I mean, this game has it still, like Tozu explaining the concept of the death game to the characters, or like going over the rules in their bracelet things that happens in this chapter, is like, it's like every fucking death game and fangame has the same fucking scene, and you can basically skip all of them. Every fangame where the mascot shows up, it's just the boringest shit ever. But your world feels weird if the characters just don't talk about the obvious things. Like, they aren't talking about the kidnapping and the death game, and they're not dealing with emotional effects of being kidnapped and threatened. It's not like the DR games are like some rich psychological examination of the effects of captivity, but they do have their characters talk about their situations, they plan together, they talk about what's going on, why it's going on, how it's going on, especially when the premise of DR games are always so absurd that asking how is this even possible is a core part, a legitimate part of the game. So not having anyone in the group sit down and be like, what's happening, why is this happening, how is this happening, is really weird. Also, the DR games can get away with things that normal games can't because their tone is self-evidently parody. Its universe is never meant to seem, like, make sense or seem realistic. That's actually, like, okay, I really don't like Tozu in this. Mostly because he's just not funny, but also, Monokuma as a character is not meant to make sense in his universe. His existence defies explanation. He is a talking cartoon bear that is above time and space and the fourth wall. Tozu is just some middle-aged guy in a mask who does bad stand-up comedy. I don't know why he behaves like this, why he's trying to tell jokes, what kind of person he is. Tozu, more than anything, feels like he is the way he is just because it's trying to be like Danganronpa, and not because he fits the world or is a good addition to the story. Like, okay, I love Monokuma Theater, especially in DR2. I love every Monokuma Theater in DR2. But I don't know why they're in this, except for iconography to the DR series. I know it's strange to be playing a fan game and analyzing a fan game from the perspective of someone who does not like material that is only supplementary to something else. It's a weird situation because of, like, how long this project is and how much painstaking work I know from experience goes into making any functional video game that you can fucking publish. I just can't put myself in the shoes of a project that's primary goal is to be an homage to the DR series. And I'm not saying that that's what this fangame necessarily is, or any other. I could never speak for the creatives involved, but just for myself, I want to see people's creativity on display and see them make their own shit and capture their own ideas, and the more a creation leans into the originality and their own personality, I like that, and anytime these projects lean more heavily into just being iconography that references shit from the DR series, I like that much less. Anyways, that's a lengthy explanation of why I don't like Tozu, or Tozu Theater, or elements that don't need to be that explicitly similar to the DR games, especially not in places where the absence of other elements makes their inclusion feel, tonally dissonant. Like, without the extremely cartoony context behind this world, and the cartoonism of a mascot character, and the cartoonism of the parody angle of the DR series, and all the obviously intentional stereotypes provided by each DR game for their characters and setting and scenarios, I don't think the comedy really works without all the elements that let you know that this world is a cartoon. Okay, I kind of have to get into this because it affects almost every aspect of the narrative experience of these games. Parody, meta, you might call it deconstruction if you're an asshole. Now, let's take two death games, Your Turn to Die, Danganronpa. They have a very fundamental difference. YTDD, straightforward dramatic thriller that takes itself fairly seriously. It can have elements of comedy at times, but its premise is not meant to be a jab at some sort of industry norm. Danganronpa, to its very bones, is a parody. Technically, you would call it a reconstruction. A deconstruction is what assholes would call the Scream movies, or the Shaun of the Dead, or whatever else, which is taking the patterns within a genre and applying them to usually an opposite purpose of what they're typically intended for. Applying them in extreme situations or places that are obviously illogical in order to imply some sort of criticism, or at least poke fun at the laziness or some other aspect of these cliches. These movies generally aren't meant to be taken seriously as plots at all, and are entirely divorced from the typical purpose of, say, a zombie survival movie, which is typically not meant to be a goofy comedy. A reconstruction is what an asshole would call a story that is both a parody, that does all the same shit as a parody, but then also recreates the whole formula of the genre from the broken pieces after smashing the cliches apart with their criticisms, and turns it back into a story that can still be consumed in a relatively serious way. A reconstruction does not have to be comedic, in fact most aren't. Chances are, if you watch a movie and, you expected the plot to go in a certain direction, and you kind of felt weird near the end, and then it doesn't go in that direction at all, and there's a chance you are watching, you're like, why did it end that? Wait, it's over? What? There's probably a chance you are watching an attempt at a reconstruction. Take 2024's Anora. Spoilers for Anora.
Annie, I got a kid who wants someone who speaks Russian. Let's go.
No, I'm eating my food.
You're killing me. He's a spender. Come on, let's go. Hello, this is the beautiful Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie.
I'm Ivan.
It was really weird. And I love him.
No way.
Yes way.
Bruh.
And I'm seeing him again tonight.
Will you marry me?
Seriously?
Seriously.
3 carrots.
What about 4?
You hit the lotto, bitch.
I know.
Bro, didn't I tell you?
Are you happy?
Very happy.
Ivan, your parents are gonna kill you.
I love my husband.
You do not know this guy.
We are consenting adults.
If you think this is gonna be allowed, you're dead wrong.
Do not touch me.
Like Cinderella.
Yes, Cinderella.
We are married. They're gonna have to accept that. Doesn't matter about anything, okay?
Pretty simple explanation. If you watch the trailers, you probably think this movie is about young, passionate, star-crossed lovers in, maybe exciting, maybe dramatic, maybe comedy, adventure, where they get together in spite of the boy's dangerous mafia-coded parents' disapproval of their relationship. Indeed, you could watch most of the movie and still think that that's kind of what the movie is. But that's just a cliche that we expect to happen only because we expect writers to make these kinds of enjoyable, cliched outcomes. If you think logically about what would happen in real life with everything that we've been shown in the movie about these people, it makes sense that none of this works out, and the kid is a flaky, spineless jackass who impulsively wanted to rebel against his parents and childishly thought he was in love with a girl, and convinced her to marry him, and the whole movie she wants to hang on to this notion that they're actually in love, and that he would not give up on what they really want together, and that he really wants to be with her. If you're not sure if this is going to be a realistic movie or a cliched movie, you can reach basically the last 20-30 minutes of this 2-hour film and still reasonably expect that the cliched outcome will happen. But then it ends you with this depressingly cold, miserable scene of our heroine and one of the supporting characters who just get nothing at all. That have to step out of the fun Cinderella story and go back to their normal lives. And the surprise realism of the ending is what asks you as the audience member to consider what you expected to happen and why, and reassess how you interpreted all the prior events and details. This is clearly meta commentary, or at least meta adjacent. It relies on some sort of meta expectation. It primes the audience based on tone and plot events and marketing and whatever to prime the audience to consider their biases and informed by their narrative cliches, aka consider their relationship to storytelling. This is a relatively simple reconstruction, and it involves very little comedy that you probably think when you hear the words parody or meta. You might notice a similarity between that Anora trailer that I showed and the DR games in that the marketing material blatantly lies pretty much about what the thing actually is, in order for the twist on your genre expectations to surprise you and garner the reactions that they want. To reconsider what you expected and why you expected it, and what your genre expectations led you to overlook or ignore along the way. For Anora, the meta obviously has this double meaning behind it, because our expectations for the cliched Cinderella story, but with a bad bitch from Brooklyn and a Russian pothead, also reflects Annie's character, in that she was blinded to the red flags at the start of this relationship and the movie because she wanted to believe in the fantasy of her young love story, right? If our relationship with cliches is similar to Annie's relationship with this Cinderella fantasy, what does that say about us? In many ways, we probably admire Annie's headstrongness and her full commitment to believing in her husband and their future together, and she takes no shit. She stands bravely in the face of all consequences of reality that are telling her to stop, and even though her faith in this guy is naive and misplaced, should we criticize her incredible sense of self and her belief in standing up for her ideals, the outcome that she wanted? What does that mean for the Cinderella story itself? It feels like it's naive, and the reality is bland and painful, but what we admire about the heroine is all of the passion and belief that her life could be as beautiful as she dreams of. So, was it bad in the end when reality crushes that dream? It's messy, it's complicated, and that's what good meta is supposed to do. It creates a narrative experience for us, utilizing the unique aspects of how we engage with storytelling as opposed to how we engage with real life, and then uses that unique relationship that we have with media and with fiction to draw a logical and emotional link between our relationship with fiction and the story and what it's saying about our relationship with any other aspect of life that stories usually talk about. There's like a million movies with this basic structure. Oftentimes, people don't know how to interpret these sorts of movies, often just experience them like, I was enjoying it, but then it had a weird ending that made no sense to me. Anyways, the point is, meta is not a term that I cast around with mediocre expectations. Meta, to me, doesn't mean Deadpool made a copyright joke, okay? Meta isn't a throwaway gag in an otherwise completely straightforward story. Meta is a fiendishly clever way of expressing themes through considering our relationship to the complicated and abstract boundary that exists between our reality and our sense of storycraft. Danganronpa's blood is in Meta. It's both a critical comedy interpretation of its tropes and of its coarse way of talking about the genres and the industry, and also a semi-serious reconstruction that takes all of the pieces that it breaks apart from making fun of them and reforges them into something surprising and fresh feeling. What I'm saying is that literally every narrative element was conceived through a meta lens first and foremost. Every character was created out of an attempt to parody cliches, archetypes, and build on them in unusual ways. Every plot point is a cliche. The premise is a combination of cliches all shoved together in this unholy amalgamation. I always tell people to go back and look at like the first 10-20 minutes of DR1 from the context of understanding all of the anime and manga cliches they're working from. With retrospect, it should scream parody to you. Literally just like this painfully cliched life in springtime hard fucking musical cut. Over the most cliched blue sky, over a generic idyllic anime city, and instantly, with no pretense, getting exposition dumped about a special school for abnormal people.
The uniforms are completely unrealistic and look nothing like anything that would ever be worn in a real Japanese school, and they've got this sort of sleek, almost sci-fi aesthetic to them, which means that this is not going to be just a high school, but a special school for abnormal people. The fact that both characters are holding some kind of spectral-looking weapon means that it's probably going to be a school where everyone has superpowers and which has some kind of school-sanctioned battling going on for some stupid-ass reason. Every season has at least 2 shows like this, and the fall season has 3 which are nearly identical.
Just do a quick Google search about how many generic trashy fucking anime and manga all start with a lazy exposition dump about how the protagonist is about to start attending a special school for special people. White Westerners mostly consume only the most mainstream anime that gets overseas, and we don't have the same culture of kids going to bookstores and picking up some manga to read over the week. White Western anime fans probably don't even consume half of the trashy bullshit that gets pumped out in anime and manga, and yet you can still probably list at least 20 anime that are entirely based on the dumbass premise of a special high school for special high school kids. Not even a minute into this exposition dump from Makoto, he starts to tell us details that are meant to drive the point home about how obviously dumb this universe is. This is a high school this is a special, like, industry-leading high school that is apparently going to teach a pop idol to be a better pop idol, and it will teach the best biker gang thug to be better at committing petty crimes or something. They parody the idea that the protagonists of these stories are often completely boring average nobodies who get into the special school for dumb or arbitrary reasons by literally telling us that they literally let this random gormless kid come based on a lottery. Everything about the universe is supposed to be broken, and it is supposed to not make sense. It is supposed to take exaggerated or contradictory cliches in the industry, in the genre, of which there are countless to work from, especially in the manga industry, for many technical and cultural reasons, relies heavily on reuse of tropes in order to pump out content at the pace that the manga industry demands. The bones of every single character and the premise and events of the plot and the character arcs and the details of the universe are all Frankensteins that are created from the parodies of these manga cliches. And then they are forced to act within the broken logic that remains of this world. They're forced into circumstances that the cliches don't have familiarity with and can't adapt to in a way that makes normal sense. And in doing so, using problem solving, they create something fresh and fun out of those pieces. So, not to get too much into the original DR games, but long story short, this crucial understanding of the narrative foundation of DR as a franchise underpins a lot of my criticisms of Eden's Garden. Eden's Garden is not a thorough parody that created everything inside it out of a deliberate and creative deconstruction of specific cliches with specific commentaries and specific redesigns. Its universe is not an abstract miasma of incompatible tropes being forced through rhetoric to come together and form their own governance separate from the laws of reality. So the fact that the universe doesn't have this fundamental baseline, that it's all not really supposed to make sense, and that it's all fundamentally broken in some way, one, there's just, you don't have the same clever commentaries going on, but two, it affects every part of the attempt to copy the surface-level stylings that Danganronpa has. If I'm in a universe that I'm meant to be taken seriously, and not in some abstract parody universe, then the comedy is gonna feel really different. Now, it feels really fucking weird when characters don't act like human beings and just goof around in insanely frightening and traumatic situations. The tone of the game being silly does not feel right or make sense anymore in this context. Like, Monokuma, as a character, he exists beyond the fourth wall. He is described in the story as impossible and unnatural by most characters. He is a parody. He is a cartoon that walks between the fiction and the ostensibly real world that these characters believe they are stuck in. Because the characters, they all believe that they live in a real world that makes logical sense, and then Monokuma is the only character that knows that they're actually living in a parody that doesn't make sense. So the characters are like, in real life, wouldn't the police do something? And Monokuma's like, don't you know the police don't do anything? They only exist as bit players to be defeated by the bad guy to show how strong they are. Monokuma knows that they are living in manga logic world, and not the real world like all the characters think that they do. Monokuma doesn't have to abide by the laws of physics, and it feels natural in the story for him to not be constrained by reality. Whereas Tozu, some adult fucking man, can pop out of floorboards. No one ever notices him suddenly appearing or how he's leaving. They don't talk about or look for these secret passages that he's supposedly using to just pop up. It's taken as a given that our suspension of disbelief will take care of anything that doesn't make sense or is clearly silly, even though the premise of the meta is totally different from DR, and thus obviously affects our level of suspension of disbelief and our tolerance for tone and logic. Now, when a character acts inhuman and unnatural, I don't have the suspension of disbelief that the world is fundamentally unserious or broken on purpose, and I also don't have the fun of meticulously analyzing what tropes they're combining, converting, playing off of, playing off the expectations, and to what end. Sometimes it's clever and interesting to just understand the simple reconstruction at play, like how I described Enora, where the trope implies one thing, but the reconstruction forces the inconsistencies within a cliché onto the trope to reveal it to become something else, like with Asahina's character in DR1. Or it can be fun to just see what the result is when you cram a bunch of different clichés together that no normal writer has ever instinctively thought would go together, like with Tenko's character in V3. The entire landscape of DR, it feels like this mad scientist's lab, where we all get to mix and match and boil and filter and harvest every strange combination or situational affectation on all sorts of tropes and have fun exploring a new frontier of what comes out of these experiments. Sometimes it's just wild and original. Sometimes it's clever in surprisingly complex ways. It feels like we're exploring together with like the soul of the game or the voice of the author, so to speak, as it speaks to us and we speak back to it about our relationship with fiction, mostly in terms of our sense of comedy and entertainment value from fiction. Now, I neither expect nor insist that any fangan has to embrace this foundation. They can have their own interpretations of the DR franchise and use whatever elements of it that they want, but the point that I'm making is that zany shenanigans and wildly inconsistent tones don't make as much sense if the world isn't clearly a parody, if it wasn't built from the ground up out of obviously dumb cliches, and thus creates its own sense of logic based on those tropes. You know, DR does a lot of work to make sure that its handling of meta is consistent. There's no clever meta here, and frankly, I find the inclusion of the occasional fourth wall break to throwaway unfunny line from Tozu kind of depressing, because it reflects how little anyone actually appreciates the depth potential of meta storytelling, that Tozu saying plot twist is somehow meant to be a faithful recreation of how DR's meta is interpreted. So like Cassidy taking nothing seriously, making bad jokes all the time, hours after having her life threatened, is just weird to me. Jean dressing like a roleplay sex worker feels weird to me. Literally anything Tozu ever does or says, I'm like, why? Why is this in here? Not to read too much into it, but I suspect that some people who might normally have these criticisms of this game don't recognize them as criticisms, or are not recognizing them as issues because they're not questioning the tropes they've come to expect from a fangan. In an ironic sense, this is literally the opposite of what Reconstruction and the DR series was supposed to do. If meta storytelling is meant to make us see the contradictions in our expectations of stories based on our flaws and our habits of things that we consume regularly, and reflect on why we ever thought these cliches made sense to begin with, this is the opposite. Fans of this won't question why Tozu behaves this way or is written this way, or like the floorboards thing or any other weird illogical thing, because it's a DR fan game thing, and each trait is in its surface level way comparable to Monokuma or whatever, so it's just natural and expected, right? And like, anyways, that's just the foundation for a lot of my observations. I don't think that the average fan is in a headspace where they stop and ask, does this make sense, and does this element fit into this story? This is neither here nor there for this chapter of Peg. I just thought it was an interesting thing that I identify with how people consume this type of media, because it is the key personality difference that leads to someone else saying, yeah, it sure is, God, Damon's, it sure is dangerous to have a pharmacy. What if someone uses it for evil? Versus me being like, what? You already have knives from the kitchen, which no one has even mentioned before the investigation. The rooms, some of them have their own weapons. Literally a piece of rope is all you really need to kill someone. If someone decides they want to kill, they can do so easily. Pharmacy medicine isn't like poison. Usually you need to take a lot of something and mix it with something else, like alcohol, to even get a particularly adverse reaction. I'm sure that the plot will bend over backwards anyways to make a needlessly convoluted murder scheme regardless of what the kids have access to. And even if the medicines are dangerous, you can bag it up and put it somewhere secure and guard it if you really think it's that big of a deal. Also, having access to medicine is probably important, especially if any of the students have existing prescriptions they need refilled to function normally, if anyone is on an anti-anxiety, an antipsychotic, insulin, or hormone supplements like melatonin. If I didn't have access to melatonin, I'd probably kill someone without incentive. I watched so many people play through this and say insane shit like, oh no! Ava's right! If they know that Damon doesn't like swimming, they might be able to murder him! Which is just so fucking... like, how do you imagine that a murder happens? Like, you swing a blunt object at someone's head, they die. They die right there, or they go out and then you just kill them. It just says Damon dislikes swimming. It doesn't say that he doesn't know how to swim. It just says he doesn't like swimming. Also, what body of water do you think an adult man could die in reasonably if he doesn't know how to swim? That is somehow they have access to. Even trying to think in terms of dumb anime logic, the story itself has no shortage of ways for someone to murder someone else if they wanted to. Apparently in this world, you can splash some water on someone and then throw a battery at them, and it apparently just kills them. It doesn't seem like characters lack the means of murder, Pretty much the only thing that ever holds anyone back in any of these games is the motivation to murder. That is it. But people with this personality type are like, they're quick to invent these. They're inventive. Like their primary thought process is inventive. So they're quick to invent imaginary worlds where the things that the story says are somehow important, no matter how impractical such a world would be. Like, you know how people get away with murder in real life? You walk up to a stranger, alone in like a place with no CCTV cameras or whatever, you fucking stab them, and then you just walk away. There are no realistic means of tracking you down. There's no convoluted scheme to have like an alibi at the time or pin it on someone else. Just spend as little time with the body as possible, leave no evidence, walk away. Now, being a dumb anime complex mystery game, the characters obviously have to have these stupid, needlessly complex murder schemes, but that does not make them logical or intelligent for the characters to be doing them. Like, if I were to describe my personality compared to, let's say, a normal anime fan, quote-unquote, their brain is prioritizing inventing ideas, so they're constantly seeing things and just allowing that to inspire them to imagine a scenario out of thin air. A streamer sees them looking at the rolling pin, and then Damon says something about, like, hey, see, they grip this like a tennis racket, and then the streamer's brain goes, tennis! What about the character who does who does the tennis?
Yes. Look, can you see how the handprints are at the base of the pin? You aren't rolling much dough if you're wielding this thing. Oh, is that what he got hit with? Like a tennis. Oh, wait a second. Oh, that seems ominous, huh? Tennis racket.
I mean this with good humor, of course. I love these fucking cringe lords, but that's not how I'm thinking about these things. I'm thinking reductively, so I'm assuming all outcomes are possible, and then I am eliminating the outcomes that don't make sense. And as a result, my brain is usually focused on finding ways in which whatever I am looking at or being told doesn't actually make sense, which is why I am far more likely to identify plot holes and contrivances and general criticisms of a story's logic than a lot of other players are liable to. The only character who did anything physically was Jean in exploring the academy, but he didn't try to, like, figure out how the kitchen was restocked like they talk about in DR1, or figure out where Tozu and Mara are, or see what they can get away with, or find areas that aren't covered by the cameras. Jean's only accomplishment was wandering into one of the few, like the 2 or 3 areas they have access to, and seeing that a giant gate was already wide open. Other than that, like I said, Desmond was the only character who proactively did something in the story. About the killing game. He investigated the locks and organized a workable solution that would keep people safer. Wolfgang and Jean are the only characters who posture and behave as though they are in a leadership position, but neither one of them actually does anything? They offer 2-bit opinions that don't matter about abstract concepts with no tangible purpose that are borderline irrelevant. Eloise at one point asks why they aren't trying to escape, and Kai's like, oh my god, we already tried. We did like a half-hearted thing with no structure, and we didn't talk about it for like 5 minutes 2 days ago. Clearly there's no... We tried our best to escape. Damon says on the first night that there's no way that these villains will be caught by the police. He says this confidently with no evidence in the face of a situation that, if it were to happen in real life, has no capacity for comparison. Nothing like this has happened in real life. But Damon and many other characters just act like they know everything about the killing game, quote-unquote. They're like, oh, it's really dangerous to be doing this in a quote-unquote killing game, as if a killing game is somehow a real thing that they can compare something to. Then later, Kai asks why they haven't been rescued by the police yet, and then Damon has like a fucking Alzheimer's bout and says something like, oh my god, Kai's right. Why haven't we been rescued by the police? So, I think that the story runs face first into the opposite of the ethos of Danganronpa, as in, this story relies on death game cliches without even realizing that they're relying on cliches that don't make any sense, and without applying them critically. Every opinion that a character has on the concept of the killing game is based on death game cliches, and not real-life logic. I'm also at least a little miffed, like... how things are said to work in this universe. Like the battery exploding, the idea that the taser could have been the murder weapon because of some water, and stuff like Wolfgang's FTEs have him describe the act of being a lawyer as though somebody's only knowledge of lawyers was playing Ace Attorney. In Wolfgang's FTEs, the script has no idea what lawyers are or how they work. Like, one, if we're just talking about defense of civil suits and or, felonies or whatever, a lawyer and someone who should probably understand more about the world of politics, like Damon, would not talk about the act of being a defense attorney as defined by moral flexibility in helping the guilty avoid punishment for crimes. The theory of law is that by providing a fair and competent offense, defense, judgment, and jury, that people are afforded due process and the benefit of the doubt. So if there isn't a case to be made to convict someone who is guilty, it's not a failure of the law. It could just mean that a fair and balanced legal system did not meet the threshold to provide beyond a reasonable doubt that they were guilty, and as such, they are afforded the basic human right of innocent until proven guilty. A defense attorney should absolutely work their hardest to defend their client, because the lead prosecutor will do the same on their end, and that is what creates the fairest circumstances possible. Obviously, the legal system can't be omnipotent and know everything, and also have a clear and cut opinion on everything, so the grace of innocence is an important factor. It'd be a much worse system if lawyers were just deciding if their clients are guilty and then not defending them. And the overwhelming majority of cases, unlike a silly anime thing like Ace Attorney, are not about innocence or guilt in binary terms. Usually they have fairly clear evidence that the person is guilty. Most states don't like wasting money trying to prosecute people if they're not confident of their guilt. A trial may cover a number of crimes related to certain actions. The jury may convict on some points but not others. The lawyers also make the case to the judge about what they feel is or isn't an appropriate punishment for a conviction, and work to reach settlements ahead of actual court dates. Just because a client is guilty doesn't mean a lawyer has no role. They make sure that their client is treated fairly for the charges that they are guilty of, and aren't given harsher punishments than are warranted for the crime and the circumstances of that client. Also, most big-shot lawyers don't even do this kind of defense work. They work in big office buildings and they manage cases for large companies and are involved in bigger shit. And even bigger shot lawyers that are handling felonies and crimes are prosecuting major cases like large human trafficking rings or serial killers or big class action lawsuits, or just doing lots of boring legal paperwork for big businesses to get their permits approved or whatever else. But Wolfgang talks about himself in a way that seems to suggest he's almost entirely a public defender, which is like lawyer entry-level bitch work, like bottom rung work. So in Wolfgang's FTEs, it was pretty clear to me that neither of these characters, Wolfgang or Damon, should be talking about being a lawyer, anything like this. Damon is supposedly into debate because it supposedly utilizes his brilliant insights into politics and society and whatnot, and yet he doesn't even understand the basic concepts like the theories of the justice system. And they talk about clients as if guilt or innocence of the crime is some all-or-nothing thing, and that lawyers can only be good people when in the service of protecting people who are innocent on all the charges. And Wolfgang says that his mom was considered controversial because she only worked with women and children. What? Literally, why would that be controversial? Private practice lawyers can work with whoever they want to. That's not a thing. That's just like a single example, but there's lots of places in the script where it just feels like basic research has not been done into knowing how to talk about something or how things actually work. Okay, I guess I can complain about Damon next. So, during the trial, Damon thinks to himself, "Damn it, if only they'd listened to me, I guess people might not have killed each other." Or he'd told them that, like, if he'd told them to not use the pharmacy or something, that it could have somehow prevented the murder. And that is a deeply insane thing to think. One, the pharmacy barely matters in this case, and I don't even know why it was used other than just to include the existence of the pharmacy into the plot somehow. And two, Damon telling everyone to be suspicious of each other is not a solution. Like, it doesn't mean anything. It has no actionable effects. Desmond was the only character who proactively improved the safety of the group by identifying a problem and getting a real workable solution and sleeping in pairs, which Damon did not even want to do. Even though he's constantly complaining that if only people listen to him, somehow, even though he has no ideas and would provide no actual fucking advice to anyone, somehow things would be better if they listened to him. By Damon's own logic, he thinks that these kidnappers are so flawless and so precise that they could not possibly be stopped by the police or be overcome by the efforts of these ultimates or escaped from. So in his own opinion of the situation, he believes that there's nothing that they can do and that the kidnappers will get everything that they want. And that is, of course, to start the killing game. So it is completely illogical for Damon to then turn around and say that his non-actionable suggestions that they should have been, quote-unquote, more suspicious of whatever could have somehow prevented this murder or any other murder. Now, on one hand, yes, Damon is obviously a flawed character, and he's obviously a whiny edgelord crybaby dumbass, but it also gets jarring when the story sometimes does seem to be validating the things that he says. The fact that he is the person who accurately solves these cases, clearly that means that the plot is meant to say that he is correct about some things or understands some things. The plot seems to be validating his nonsensical idea that the pharmacy is somehow any more dangerous than anything else in their situation, and just by the nature that the plot will obviously involve the death game continuing, it's validating Damon's cynical views about trust, which in the real world would not probably make any sense. In the real world, normal people in this situation would not assume that the police can't help them. They would not assume that their violent, evil kidnappers would honor their word and just let you go free if you kill someone. They would not assume that there's no chance of escaping besides doing the killing game, or there's no way of fighting back against their kidnappers. Danganronpa exists in a world where the unrealistic is intentionally present. The whole premise of Danganronpa is itself a parody of the unrealistic, heightened settings of other games and manga. When Damon thinks shit to himself, like there's no way the police can save us because our captors are too smart, it's like, what? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? In what fucking world? In what world does any of that seem like it's physically possible or normal? There's a lot of random lines, many of them from Damon, but not all of them, that just declare things, and I'm like, what the fuck? Jean says that if the secret contains lies, if the secrets, like the blackmail secrets, contain lies, then they would be easily refuted. That makes no sense. If the group got a letter saying that, for example, Kai is a serial killer, how would he refute that in a way that wasn't just hearsay, him saying it's not true? Damon says that the letters are only useful if the other person doesn't know that you have their blackmail. What? What is he talking about? What does that mean? How exactly are these letters useful to anyone, and why would they stop being useful if that person knows that you have theirs? What? What are you saying? This is also tangentially why I find getting rid of Wolfgang and Ava early on a weird choice. Wolfgang, not so much. I expected and agreed with killing him off from a narrative perspective, but for Ava, it's just that, like, okay, our protagonist is an annoying, unlikable twerp. He's not sympathetic, the story doesn't frequently put him in situations where his standoffishness is funny or charming. Sometimes it does, like him angrily playing video games, but most of the time he is not charming at all. And the story doesn't punish him or call him out for his behavior. We don't see him punished emotionally or have other characters point out that he's wrong most of the time, because he mostly keeps his dumbass thoughts to himself where no one can argue with him and tell him why he's obviously dumb and wrong. Like, okay, during the investigation, Damon mentally insults a character for finding a clue, for finding the hairpin lockpick thing, thinking that the clue was pointless and insignificant, but it still gets added to the truth bullets, and later gets used in the trial. But Damon never stops for a beat to recognize that he was dumb and wrong before, and he only thought that to himself, so nothing else in the story acknowledges that. That is a place where I am sure that the game wants me as the player to recognize that he is in fact wrong and stupid. But I'm not sure that's true for every other place, that I think he is wrong and stupid. Because it's not like I think every other character besides Damon is always acting in a way that makes any sense either. The wild thing about Damon is that none of his opinions are even based on, like, a cold, cynical, calculating view of their objective situation. They're entirely based on his ego. He only says things or thinks things from the basis of wanting to think that he's smart and that the others are stupid. He's not thinking about how to protect himself. If he wanted to try to win the killing game or do anything that would benefit himself in like a cold, immoral fashion, he just sees things and then, like a fucking Redditor, finds a way to interpret them in like half a second and call them stupid. But he's actually doing nothing to help himself or anyone else. So I can't even enjoy him as a morally gray character, and enjoys the sort of gut-twisting experience of seeing him do particularly selfish things for his own benefit, even if they would hurt other people. His character is literally just dumb jackass Redditor. He's not evil enough to be interesting, but he's too much of an asshole for him to develop much connection with the other characters that could create some emotional attachment to the story. So anyways, all that aside, if it's going to be a long time before Damon is even a little bit likable, and I find that to be the case because the FTEs, which presumably are not going to change, these are the FTEs that are going to be available for most chapters in the game, and Damon is a jackass in all of them, so it means that he's going to be a jackass the whole game. I just find it odd that we got rid of one of the few characters that we're liable to have any sympathy or emotional attachment to already in Ava. What other character do I, as an audience member, have even the slightest bit of attachment or interest in or sympathy towards? Who am I rooting for? Diana and Kai, I guess? To a minor degree? I just think that the emotional attachment to a character is something that you're better off building up over time and then getting more complex, interesting rewards from once ripened. Not just killing off basically the only character that we even kind of want to succeed and leaving us with Damon and a bunch of other randos that we don't know that much. Of course, I'm talking as if I know what the future entails. I obviously don't know for a fact that I'm not going to have any characters that I like or have much of an attachment towards or give a fuck about what they do, but I am saying that I got sick of Damon's repetitive shit in this chapter. I think retroactively, there's a lot of interesting stuff to work with, like Damon lying about how he respected Wolfgang or admired him for pushing them to do better, which is not something that he ever thought at any point in the story, or Damon's delusional ability to just forget the things that he said that were blatantly wrong and only interpret everything through his sense of paranoid narcissism about how right he is. But I also find it strange that Damon and Ava did not talk to each other after the verdict, very much after the verdict. I thought that the point was that the characters are being paralleled. Ava is a paranoid narcissist, just like he is, and that would play off of his paranoid narcissism. Or just like the chapter title, he could be revealed for his hypocrisy in how much of a paranoid narcissist he is after trying to judge Ava for her paranoid narcissism, but instead, Ava only just yells at the others, doesn't really point out anything about Damon at all, they don't confront each other on their betrayal of trust, and it's just and Damon doesn't acknowledge or learn anything, and also no one criticizes Damon for his obvious flaws and hypocrisy in this instance. So yeah, one of my main criticisms of the whole story is just the skipping over of all the things that people would probably be doing in such an extreme situation. They're talking about the who, how, what, why, and the emotional and psychological stress, like the freaking out. Ava's the only character who feels like she's actually freaking out. I also don't like how much of the dialogue in the sections with the large group is either just characters arguing or agreeing about really innocuous nothing burgers, like whether or not to explore the pharmacy as if they could stop anyone from going if they wanted to, or weird asides that were so out of left field and unlike the rest of the dialogue that they are obviously going to be plot points later on, like the batteries or the gaming tournament. I also quite fervently don't enjoy Tozu. I don't think the game is very funny on the whole. DR's comedy ranges from lowbrow slapstick to dry, sarcastic shitposting, and Tozu is... The whole tone is way too try-hard for the comedy to work for me, and other joke characters like Cassidy, I just find their behavior jarring and, charmless. Even in a dramatic sense, Monokuma could be serious when he wanted to be, and he actually, cut people to the bone with his words. Tozu doesn't really do that either. He's always in full fucking cringe mode. He is a grown-ass man. I am embarrassed watching him. Okay, just take this as an example. Monokuma Theater works with, like, the dry, ironic absurdism. Part of that dryness comes from the fact that Monokuma Theaters are not voice acted. It's just the dry text. That's not a limitation, that is a feature. Okay, there are tonal strengths to a lack of voice acting in some places, especially for a figure with as much room for variety and delivery as Monokuma. It is not a fault of VA direction, I just think sometimes comedy works better with different modes of delivery. I do think this chapter overall is a lot more solid than I was expecting. Like, okay, the sudden escalation to, like, Ava has control over the security cameras, and that kind of thing was a bit out of left field, but that's fine, I guess. I feel conflicted with the chapter resolution because, like, okay, other parts of the chapter are going to be paid off over time, and that's fine, and I'll talk about that later. I imagine that this game has its core ideas planned out ahead of time, and the plan for the story as a whole was never written in such a way that judging it one chapter at a time is fair or makes much sense. So if it seems like I'm being overly critical or whatnot, most of what I'm saying would be thoughts in my head that I would just continue playing the video game and then I would get my answers later on. And I'd have a better idea of what is or is not intentional and what the point of all the narrative directions were, but since there's no way for me to keep playing, I'm writing this overly critical review instead. But my feelings towards specifically the parts of the chapter that have been resolved to a logically satisfying degree, a la Ava's behavioral issues, and it's like, okay, I totally get Ava as a character. She makes sense. And I do like that this kind of, like, tortured, paranoid, narcissist character archetype, even to the point that I could accept that she's the first to kill. Like, the first murder in a DR game is the hardest to justify, because human psychology means no one really wants to take a risk or break from the status quo, and because until someone dies, the threat of death is not provable yet. And also it's stupid to not think that you could just not wait to be rescued, or that the kidnappers would honor their word and just let you go if you did the killings. Again, no one in real life would think that. This is also why the first motive is important, which is one of the things that bothered me about this case, is that the motive never made sense as a threat, and in the end the motive has literally nothing to do with this murder at all. Like, Tozu did not threaten to reveal their secrets to the outside world like in DR1, he just gave random people someone else's secret, most of which are pretty pointless, and most of which seem too vague to even be used as a threat against the person. So, I don't get what the motive was even for, or how it was supposed to incite a murder at all, which it didn't. The motive had nothing to do with it. But I'm getting sidetracked. My point is that Ava makes sense to me, and I think she's a solid character, structured, clearly foreshadowed over the whole chapter. We understand her flaws and why she did this and stuff. But even then, I feel a little disappointed in the process. Like, I feel underwhelmed, I guess. Like, I could have had more emotional impact and intellectual curiosity and enjoyment towards a different use of this character. Danganronpa doesn't ever feel like that because I know that every trope and genre convention use has some clever meta-narrative structure that I can enjoy in retrospect, and the immediate emotional impact of anything is only the most surface-level aspect of a DR story. Because of that meta-narrative, I think it's more appropriate to compare this game to something like A Your Turn to Die, which I think manages to elicit a greater sense of tension and a significance and gritty drama out of major events. I guess it's because I don't think Damon changed in any way or cares about the two people that died. So it doesn't feel like a significant event with long-lasting consequences. It just feels like I understand Ava and why she did what she did, and now she's not in the story anymore, and that's pretty much it. There's a lack of tension to following a structure that DR can get around because its aim is more satirical, and everything that happens is represented by some conflict amongst the major characters, like disagreements of leadership or philosophy, like from characters like Oma or Kaito or Kamaida, or Celeste, or whoever. Even if we ignore the meta stuff and we just talk about a chapter's dramatic beats, or thematic beats, take Chapter 2 from DR2. The plot of the chapter is themed around judgment and crime and punishment. They start Chapter 2 by having an argument about if Teru Teru deserved to be executed because he tried to kill all of them. They have to figure out what to do with Kamaida, who participated in getting people killed without remorse, and the case motive is obviously about revenge, which is crime and punishment for actions. Hiyoko is around the center of this moral debate in the chapter, which both ties into information learned about her in her FTEs, about her own vicious and vengeful family situation, and her firm stance on capital punishment coming to a head when Mahiru is also killed out of revenge for a previous crime, and Hiyoko is framed in the trial. And then, going into Chapter 3, we're left with this experience of needless violence from the capital punishment, the lack of full context about Mahiru's past criminal actions, compared to our experiences with her as a character, making us unsure of how to interpret her association with the death of Fuyuhiko's sister, making us question our priors of our context for other things that we've already been judging. Like the characters whose actions we saw and witnessed, like Teruteru or Kamaida or whoever else, and then going into Chapter 3 with two separate, clear places to use this thematic lens to observe. We have Hiyoko and Fuyuhiko's dynamic going into the future, and also how we feel about crime and punishment in regards to Kamaida for the entire game, and how he has, as an entity, Kamaida challenges our commitment to any of these ideals. Like, his entire existence challenges everything that DR1 says about hope, for example, and how in the present, he challenges our notions of forgiveness for people who do crimes without remorse. A tight little story about crime and punishment wrapped up in one single chapter that can be expanded to examine several other characters in more detail, provides a basis of our worldview going into the future of the story, with long-lasting implications for several characters, and a fundamental restructuring of the group's dynamic as a whole, both in who is part of a group and what the group morally agrees with and believes in. I'm not really sure what point I'm trying to make here, but basically, I felt conflicted at the end of this chapter. Like, it was pretty good, pretty clean as a case, and as just an Eva story, but I'm not sure how much more I got out of it other than just, I understand her character, and I like this short story about her, and now this seems to be irrelevant going forwards. If the story is saying something specific about hypocrisy that we're supposed to use to thematically view something, other than pointing out Ava's own flaws and also maybe Damon's, I'm not sure what this chapter's lens is for viewing hypocrisy and what interesting retrospect it would create for us. We don't really get inside Wolfgang's head, so I'm not sure what motivated him to act the way he did at any point, so I can't comment on his hypocrisy. So I'm really just left with Damon and Ava's hypocrisy. And I don't feel like Damon learned anything at all from this chapter, or that the group learned anything, really. Diana presented a shift in her attitude or her convictions, but I don't know if that shift is related to the themes of this chapter at all. It kind of just seemed like the frustration with the brutality of the killing game itself. I can't really think of a way in which Diana was a hypocrite this chapter, so it's not out of motivation or shame or some sort of hypocrisy. Anyways, Ava makes sense, but a small story about a character that just makes sense is, like, fine, but I feel like the story is capable of doing more than that, you know? It's also entirely possible that the themes of this story are ones that I just simply disagree with. As someone with so much literary analysis experience, sometimes you run into a problem where the symbolism and message of a story are there, they just present an opinion of the world that I think is fucking stupid from the outset. So even if the story presents itself and its message in effective ways, I would still get annoyed with it because I disagree with the entire theme itself. I think that for this game, I think that the writers probably have different views of what a fictional killing game would be like than I do. I see killing games as inherently unrealistic and inherently tropey, and I see edgy, violent, cynical stories also usually as inherently unrealistic. I don't believe the average human being is as cynical and as edgy as violent media would portray them to be. This story seems to come from a belief that a killing game is something that could realistically happen, and thus requires no greater skepticism. And some of the logic in the story often suggests weird things about what would be a risk or give someone an advantage that I don't think makes any sense, like the statement about how hiding blackmail would be useful to you. Those feel less like writing hiccups and more like a fundamental disconnect between me and the writers over what we actually believe about the logic of this story, or any story like this. In terms of optional stuff, if you do the pathos route in the trial, Damon acts completely out of character from everything else that he says, does, or thinks to himself in the entire chapter in any of the FTEs, with no convincing reason as to why his personality has completely shifted from Reddit troll jackass who internalizes anything that he sees anyone else say or do as a reason for why they are the bottom rung of the human race, to, in the pathos route, his soft-spoken empath. It is completely jarring. It makes no sense. He would not say or do these things or act this way, even if he was pretending. I don't buy it even a little. This is a guy who can't take obvious sarcastic jokes that people makes without asking them if they actually believe it, because he's that fucking stupid and ignorant. He would literally never do this. Alright, let me get back into this so that I can try to explain this. So we're coming off the heels of the first morning near the start of Chapter 1, right? And this is one of the interaction with Diana is one of the only ones that I think actually has, like, good, charming dialogue. It's an interesting character interaction. It utilizes the personalities of the characters. The actual text, the prose is engaging. And it's not, on the nose. It's more of a subtle aspect of Diana's character. He's not going around, like, teasing and making fun of people all the time, so it's dipping into a less obvious aspect of her personality. But then we come into, like, to this scene, and there's a bunch of scenes like this, especially early on, the first chunk of this chapter, that... like, one, they kind of, like... Okay, the first most prominent thing is that they don't talk about anything, like, any of the subjects that they should be talking about or would be talking about. But for the things that they actually are talking about, they run on too long, there's a lot of needless lines for other characters that did not need to be added, and a lot of, like, the things that they say are very bizarre. The prose is not particularly interesting. There are no memorable lines from anyone. Even right starting here, like, this is deeply insane. Upon entering the room, I instantly felt the disapproving gazes of the other Ultimates. So, they, like, so they slept through the night in a room that they'd never been, in a place that they've never been. All of these fucking people, all of these more or less children, young adults, children, including a literal child, in this scenario, after being kidnapped and told that they're in a location that makes no sense, after they're being told that they're in a nonsensical killing game and that their lives are in danger and that they're being forced to do illicit things, and apparently they weren't stewing on that overnight. No. Apparently, at least according to Damon and his observation, is that they are more concerned that Damon was rude to them and kind of a douchebag than, my fucking life is over. I walked to the main table and grabbed a seat, trying to ignore their stares. Oh no, look, it's the kind of rude guy. Behind me, I heard Cassidy arriving. Alright, Cassidy's attitude never makes sense under these circumstances. There are times, I will say, like, there are times in, like... Now, the main thing that changes the tone of these games, Danganronpa 1 is relatively serious. Like, there are gaggy bits, but it's, like, the most demure and downtrodden of the three mainline DR games. DR2, a lot of it is comprised... One of the major differences is not just, like, the overall universe has this degree of cartoonism and parody, but also they don't talk about the killing game as much. Like, not every single conversation that the characters have revolve around the killing game, quite like it is in this chapter, where every single group meeting is about the killing game or about the motive, or like, oh, we're in here, how will this involve in the killing game? And even in situations where Wolfgang is presumably like presiding that they should be more carefree or what. So the fact that they are, one, it's immediately introduced to the killing game, and two, that it's basically all they ever talk about, in any scenario. It's just very odd for any character to behave so casually. Period.
How we feeling?
Alright, I have exciting news. So this is like first day, overnight, had to sleep on it, if they could have gotten sleep in this terrifying scenario in the first place. Come in here, and then the first thing is like, alright, John is like, I have news. I left my dorm room to do exploring. By exploring, he means I walked down like 2 hallways, and I walked into one of the other 2 rooms that exist in this complex that we're in. I don't get the sense that Jean investigated the basement, because I don't generally think that. Later on, there's a conversation where they're talking about whether the things that they may or may not have seen, because Ava suggests that there's a spare generator or something in one of the basement side rooms. So if Jean's saying that he explored the academy, apparently this does not include the the basement rooms that actually have shit in them to, like, scour through. And I also kind of don't get the impression that he looked through all of everything that's in the kitchen or pantry, which we can't really see entirely visualized, but this is a ridiculous point in the first place, because okay, he's like, I didn't sleep. This line offends me personally, because I have multiple chronic sleeping disorders that are extremely severe, and this is a ludicrous statement to say for someone who is often awake at night. Anyways, back to my story. The first oddity I found, this is the most, like, deeply insane thing. Ever since I first played through this chapter 1, this was the thing that, like, stuck out in my mind as an example of the bad dialogue in these giant group meetings and all these scenes where like the majority of the characters are present. Alright, so again, this is the first thing that they're talking about after getting together, after basically the last thing that happened was Tozu introduced the threat that they're all stuck here and they're all gonna fucking die. Alright, go have a sleep. They come out here and John's like, dude, the janitor's closet. I know. We were all thinking about the janitor's closet, right? Right, like everyone, like checking the stock market, right? It's like, God, I need to know. You gotta keep me updated play by play. What's going on with the janitor's closet? It's so important. This is clearly what everyone cares about, the janitor's closet.
Oh.
And then the other characters are like, oh my, now, I'll talk about why I think it was written this way. But, okay, so then this statement is insane. This line is absolutely insane from Eloise. Do you think something dangerous? It's like saying, I mean, I don't know. Do you think anything that you can't know for certain? There's no evidence for or against anything, and they've been inside the janitor's closet before. It didn't have anything in it in the first place. It had nothing interesting at all. It's just a generic, pretty sparse janitor's closet. It's just a tiny little room. So, it was locked by someone, I guess. It doesn't really matter. There's no reason for them to want to go in there. It seems like the most innocuous thing. I am certain that the reason it was written this way is because this will become plot relevant in a later chapter. I am certain that the only possible reason I could imagine that this fucking dialogue was added to this scene is because they need to foreshadow an event later on. And that's why they not only need to mention the fact that it was locked, even though it's like such a mundane thing to focus on, and not only just mention it, but also have multiple characters talk about the fact that it's locked back and forth with each other so that it's not just a single line, so that the player has to have paid attention to it, right? They have to be aware of what they're actively talking about. So they add like 4 or 5 or 6 bloated lines of characters saying insane shit that no one would ever say, like this. What? Do you think something dangerous is being kept? I don't know. Do you think literally anything ever that you could be happening or could be possible that you don't know or don't know? And then he responds to, this is also an somehow even more insane line, because he's responding to a baseless theoretical, a theoretical based on literally nothing, and then he's like acting like it's surprising. Really? And then she's doing the same thing, so 2 lines. Again, I'm certain that the only reason these lines are added is to give these characters something to contribute to these conversations, so they can use their sprites and remind you that they exist and they are in the room. Even though they're providing nothing. Like, the last 3 lines have provided nothing to the conversation at all.
Hold your horses.
This line is just funny to me. She makes a good point. It's basically impossible to judge things that you just don't know. Did you know that you don't know things when you don't know them? Did you know that people die when they are killed? It's safe to say that because the door is locked, I can't get into it, and therefore I don't know. What the fuck? All I can tell you is that we can't enter because it is locked, and locked means that we cannot enter the door. Why do we need these lines?
Okay.
Yeah, it's true that people die when they are killed.
Sheesh.
And then another fucking line restating the same thing that is on a non-conversation. We're like 8 lines in at this point. And now we're like, alright, cool, the janitor's closet was locked. Great. What's the next point?
Really?
Take a breather.
So, okay, that's just an example that I just find really funny, but, like, a lot of these scenes, and it's only these scenes, it's not the FTEs, it's not, like a handful of, like, individual, you talk to, like, 1 or 2 characters at a time, those are usually fine. But these big scenes where everyone's in a group have, like, these weird fucking extensions of conversations based on nothing, like they're saying nothing, or like you have like 4 people just repeat the same point over and over, back and forth, or just have some characters just chime in to say something absolutely insane. Hang on, I want to skip forwards.
Leave it to me.
I also find this statement weird. What do you mean the tree's a bit of a hike? It's like literally like 30 seconds away.
Huh?
Okay, this, I also think that, like, this probably makes more intuitive sense in, like, a text adventure game, but, like, if your watch that you're literally wearing on your wrist makes a sound, you wouldn't, like, have, like, look around the room and, like, say entire sentences and have conversations about it. You would just look at the watch. You would just look at the watch. So all those lines before they look at their watch are totally pointless, and you could have probably just written, like, I looked at my watch, and then have him comment on that, and then glance up to see that everyone else was doing the same thing or something. Like, brevity. Okay, hang on. Jet has a line here that is, like, that confounds me. What the fuck is this line? Turns out we were right, calling the dining room a dining room. Hey, have you ever been in a building, like walked into a building and you see like a large room with tables and chairs that is attached directly to a kitchen, and then you're like with a friend, and then you find a building map, and then it says dining hall, and you're like, bro, check it out! We called it! Dude, isn't it so interesting that, like, we said it was a dining hall? And look, the map confirms it validated our suspicion. That's a dining hall! What I find strange about all of this is that I have almost none of these complaints with the FTEs. I don't even really like most of the FTEs in the baseline DR games, but here, they are the best part of the script. Some of them even talk about things that I find to be so strange to be missing from the base game. Like, Wolfgang at least briefly mentions the concept of trying to collect information from the others to try to understand why they were all targeted for this killing game. They don't really get into that, it's a totally throwaway line, but it's like, yeah, why aren't we talking about that? I just think way too much of the script for the main plot is filled with painfully rigid, unsubtle exposition about things that will become important later on, either in this chapter or in future chapters, like gaming tournament, batteries, portable game console, switching rooms, secret in the pharmacy, Ulysses randomly talking about how he can't smell, blah blah blah. Then more big chunks of dialogue are just unfunny comedy, random brief lines that seem to just exist to give a character a way to be present in the conversation, even if they're not adding anything to the conversation, and then characters arguing about ethereal, stupid shit, like the fact that anyone for even a moment thought that Ava's bonkers argument about the profiles somehow being dangerous made even a bit of sense is already insane. That's just ridiculous. I just think that whatever mindset they have while writing the FTEs, they gotta incorporate that mindset more into the main story. Like, the plot can't be carried by unsubtle foreshadowing of whatever the next murder scheme is going to be, and then solving that said murder scheme. It's gotta feel at least a little bit believable to the direction of either making it be more realistic or finding ways to lower the suspension of disbelief that we feel, and it's gotta make us have fun and care about what's happening on a human level. I think it's unfair to base this off of the vocal majority of the fan base of this project because, one, fan project, people are supporting it because they want to support it, not because they're coming in with an unbiased perspective that, you know, they just want good video game-age. And two, because, like, we all know anime fans are the most rose-colored glasses degenerates on the face of the fucking planet, and that you could probably whip up a sketch of an OC in crayon and show it to them, and then they'd convince themselves that they've fallen in love with this character in like 5 minutes and start writing fan fiction about how they'd die for them. You don't have to have characters talking about stuff that's plot important. You can just have them talk about things that give them character, focus on the dynamics between characters and how they would rub off on each other, rather than focusing on individual characters having lines that only express themselves and themselves alone. Focus on the dynamics, on the energy, the themes, the mundane details that make up a person's life and quirks and humanity. Then you cut all of the dialogue that is not working or is not convincing or interesting. Creative writing is like 90% coming up with this shit and then cutting and trimming the shit that doesn't hit right. I watch these scenes and I see tons of lines that should have been totally cut and tons of places where they have more things to talk about, but they just don't talk about them. So, I like to soak test with writing. I think that there's a lot of subtleties that you fail to appreciate in writing at a glance, and there are some appeals that like hit you quickly but fade fast, and there's some appeals that grow on you over time. And so I want to keep going back to the same story over and over again and linger with it to feel what parts I start to get more bored of or more frustrated by, what parts I start appreciating more. In the course of playing through this chapter several times, bug testing, doing all the FTEs, watching like a dozen fucking streamers going through it, I can say that I don't like, I don't like almost any sequence of the main story. I don't hate most of it, I just always felt like, oh, this part, can we get to a different part during almost every single scene? Do I really want to rewatch the dining room conversation about the janitor's closet, or that part where they go on for way too long about how they should decide the room pairs via arm wrestling or whatever else? After soak testing to gauge my feelings, I can conclude that the most engaging and successful scenes are, like, the one where Grace and Ulysses switch rooms. That scene is fun, pretty grounded, character-driven, and it has good dynamics that I can actively appreciate. It doesn't have a lot of needless fluff text, probably because that scene only has the relevant characters present for it, so you don't need to find a way to give some rando like Jet or Mark some fucking line or two being like, yeah, I'm also here. And the scene in the trial of Diana recounting Wolfgang's final moments, I like that part. I like, a handful of the Damon talking to someone in the pharmacy sequences, and then almost every other scene, once I've already played through it, I have no more expectations for what's going to happen. I know all of the the plot information that it's provided me with already, and most of the other scenes just aren't engaging or interesting or exciting or fun. Meanwhile, I feel like most of the FTEs are great, and I enjoy simply reading through them regardless of if I already know the raw plot information that they provide, because they are scripted in fun ways. I think you have to make sure that the prose of the writing and the scene direction is just inherently enjoyable regardless of the substance of like what plot relevant information you want to convey. You want to try to make each moment or scene of media offer a lot of different layers or forms of entertainment. Emotion, engaging prose, not just writing sentences in the same way any other writer would, writing lines that stand out and are memorable, character subtext to read into, a palpable, palatable tone, intentional, multi-layer dynamics between the characters and each other, plot events that are actually interesting to watch play out in real time, conversations that are actually interesting. Ideally, each scene would allow for some depth of subtext that you could write a whole fucking 20 pages into a character's Wikipedia bio based on that scene alone. And of course, importantly, the overall story needs to feel like it's believable, so things feel like they matter. I can't feel any sense of dread or stress, anything to empathize with strong emotions in this situation, because none of these characters are reacting to it in a way that feels believable, and they aren't doing or saying any of the things that I feel like are obvious things that they should be doing or saying. I will say again, I don't think this game is very funny. And you can take a direction with this sort of plot where you have to like balance the drama and the darkness and the comedy and the zaniness, or you can more prioritize the grimness and the intensity. I think as a writer, it's harder to be funny than it is to make something that feels interesting or compelling just because it's intense. I think it's especially hard to be funny when you have to balance the tone and setting and logic of the universe with what is ostensibly a grim fucking story about violence and death that is supposedly trying to be taken seriously. The only time I almost found something funny enough to crack a smirk was Damon getting angry at video games. I kind of like Kai's about to cry sprite. I like all the character signatures and their profiles that are provided. I like that Grace bangs Wolfgang's brains out. But out of all the attempts in the chapter to be funny, I really feel like not only did they do more harm than good to the tone, but I just feel like you could have successful tension instead of having unsuccessful comedy. I don't think this game could be funny to me in the way that it's trying to be without seriously contradicting the setup of its universe and the rules on which it operates. I think it'd be a better choice to have a mostly dark narrative and then sprinkle maybe some comedic subversions here and there, more similar to Your Turn to Die or any other mostly serious death game that has a small handful of gags, like fucking Squid Game is the same way. Zany humor is just really hard to do if you're trying to make a universe that feels believable or consistent. Even in other stuff with zany humor that are also serious stories at the end of the day, like One Piece is not a brutal, cynical death game about people losing their last shred of moral restraint or fucking sanity. It's just like, if that's not the direction that they want to take it in, I will say, I think making relatively simple slapstick would help generate some comedic timing. Like, look at all sorts of low-budget animated comedy projects where some simple visual gag or animation is utilized. Like, for instance, if you watch Kill La Kill, the anime, they have a team capable of animating at the highest levels of complexity, but they often do really rudimentary animation gags for comedic impact.
Yeah, for you! That's why I chopped them off, dipshit!
I'm kidding. If you chop them off, they'll just pop right back on again.
Oops. Oops again.
I feel that with touching up some of the current emotive sprites characters have, or adding some new sprites, you could get into visual gags a little bit, have more of an energy to the comedy or more expressiveness. Like, I specifically replayed this chapter focusing on the sprite work, and one thing I noticed is that every time a character says something, and then there's supposed to be a comedic reaction shot of a character going like, whatever, in response, their sprites are not funny, and the timing is not funny. When I was fast-forwarding, like just clicking through these scenes to grind out all the FTEs, it was apparent to me watching a fast-forward of these events that most of these character sprites are pretty placid, and mostly it's just each character either in their neutral pose, maybe some slight sweat spots on whatever in their face. Not that much is that snappy or expressive. Ava has a couple expressive sprites. One thing that's easy to forget in making stills for characters is that there is still motion in the game. The transition from one shot to the next, one sprite to the next, is motion, and that carries with it the potential of comedic timing and visual gags. If you look at scenes like from DR games, they utilize more transitions between visually different sprites of a single character between two lines, whereas in this, very frequently, even if characters do have sprites that are quite different or expressive, they mostly get cut to from a different character's line, so instead of them being in a neutral sprite and then transitioning to the expressive sprite on the next line. So your eye is not seeing their motion as the character sprite changes from one sprite to the next. There's also other small visual and audio effects DR and other VNs use to sell certain visual comedy or drama or whatever else, like character sprites in DR flash with like this bit of white light for a fraction of a second and a sound effect plays. And this, Eden's Garden has that, but in this, it's just like the screen behind the sprite of the character turns white for a moment. The character sprite itself doesn't do anything. It doesn't visually change in any way. And again, talking about how important it is to make sure, like, Mario's jump is just right, you can go a long way with making smaller details that impact the brain's audio-visual pickup, intake of sensory information, and feel more emotions and get more of a sense of overall production quality without having to add things that are like overly complex and tough to create on the development side. The brain is going to pick up on subtle motion and animation. If you have the white light behind the character sprite instead of the sprite itself lighting up, the brain is not going to perceive that the character moved in any way, or thus the emotion and the characterization from the sprite itself. On that note, currently, when a character does transition from one sprite to another while you're looking at the same character, it kind of looks like the first sprite is doing a fade out, while the new sprite is doing a fade in, but because of that, they're overlapping in the middle in a way that looks bad. I don't think it looks very good right now. I'm not a fan of like the dual fade in and out at the same time. So like, okay, let me take some examples of simple VN animations and transitions that convey character energy. I'm not trying to suggest that like any of this is comedic genius. I think DR is at its best when it's doing dry, satirical shitpost comedy that feels like you and your bros just got done watching a bad movie and you're making fun of it and you're at least a little drunk. But let's just take two examples from DR2 of the usage of sprite transitions, meta elements, stuff like that.
Emergency!
So this uses sprite transitions and effects for contrast. It uses out-of-universe elements like the syntax of the text box itself, and it uses other established elements like the pointing sprite or the pointing VA line that we've already heard plenty at this point in the game, but in a sort of parodied context, emphasizing the fact that the only sprite and VA line that was made for a character to convey pointing in a direction was only designed to fit a singular tonal situation and seems offbeat in this instance. Look, like, okay, any comedy will lose its charm the more you try to explain it. Especially things that are funny just because they don't quite add up right. But my point is that it leverages not just the elements themselves, like the sprite and the voice line, but it is very cognizant of the transition and the comedic timing between sprites, and the metatextual application of fourth wall-breaking elements like the limitations of sprite work, the availability of voice lines, the text box syntax, etc.
On my grandfather's... On my grandfather's... On my grandfather's...
Emergency!
I vastly prefer this clip, although I apologize that the random YouTube video I stole this footage from clicks through each dialogue box at like a fucking snail's pace, and that kills the comedic timing. I would have recorded it myself, but I don't wanna. This is more offbeat, dry, shitpost meta humor. At first, it probably hits this uncanny valley to read the line, but for some reason the voice line doesn't read the last word of the line. And then there's an ironic comedy to the fact that this voice line was recorded at all for an otherwise non-voice acted part of the game, just to be recycled three times for this bizarre gag. It's using the out-of-universe elements like your understanding of the fact that they had to record this voice line as part of the idiosyncrasy that makes it weird and funny. And again, Monokuma gives the impression of a character that is aware of this metatextual stuff and is doing this intentionally. Like, he intentionally created a gag with an incomplete voice line that he recorded just to be used in this one tiny segment just because he can. This is just a small example, but this leans into what I'm saying about how, like, the character in the universe is inherently between worlds. It's not just like, oh, an occasional crack about how it's a video game or whatever. There is an entire sequence in DR2 where Monokuma just forces you to play a Zero Escape game. I don't want to be like an ageist or call myself old in the process now, but I think that this kind of sarcastic meta-examination cannot really be achieved by super young writers who haven't become jaded to all of these things and who don't have the same like holistic understanding of these industries and genres and cultures and the people who make them and the people who consume them. Half of listening to some of the people that worked on PEG was an experience of thinking, oh my god, oh no, oh you poor sweet baby, oh my god, oh I'm fucking old, I'm a fucking old person now. I mean, like, this is kind of the irony of basically DR's entire Western fan base. The series is making fun of all of these Japanese tropes, but the Western anime fans are not, like, jaded, cynical edgelords who really even know that much about these specific tropes and their decades-long histories. So they just consume DR games in a totally unironic way. Also, kids tend to find things funny that I stopped laughing at years and years ago. Like, I'm not gonna be fucking slapping my knee, fucking busting a gut laughing because Damon is turned on by a sensual male model. Anyways, let me use an example from a game that I just finished playing, Misericord. It makes simple and intelligent leverage of its art assets and its character sprites with very basic but effective transitions to convey senses. This insanely simple transition from Eustace looking to the side, cutting to her eyes looking in our direction, conveys way more intention and emotional impact of the characters sharply looking at you than just going from some generic-looking sprite and then fading out to a totally different wild-looking one. The only thing that changes is the direction of her eyes, so we interpret that as a sharp, pointed motion. Simple fades to convey certain types of motion in an imaginary space are used. The character portrait facing left or right is used to convey some sort of the implication of motion or physical space, etc. And just in general, tiny things like a button that you press in a menu, like briefly lighting up for a fraction of a second alongside the sound effect to convey that you pressed it, every single little thing that the player interacts with, you can add a bunch of little touches that are relatively simple to implement, and will just naturally elevate the base game feel, and thus the experience of the player. Like, shit like that is really all it takes to tickle somebody's brain to make them feel like the thing that they're playing is a high-quality production. Anyways, onto some positives. My earliest thought while playing this is that the score is great. Just good tunes, good vibes. I obviously prefer when the game is at its, least homage-y. So I prefer the music that is less immediately identifiable as obvious remixes of DR music. But all of the music screams quality production, and it was all mixed appropriately and stuff. I can't even go into all the overall production value stuff because barring a few bugs and some awkwardness with the presentation of some of the menus, it's a really solid production quality. I like some of the character dynamics and developments in theory. I like Damon and Kai's dynamic. I think long-term that can be interesting. Other than Diana, who obviously becomes more prominent in this chapter, if only by herself, the chapter really is mostly comprised of this tight story between Wolfgang and Ava, and all of the Wolfgang and Ava stuff was appropriately paced and played and had a lot more subtlety than I was honestly expecting, considering how unsubtle some of the other delivery of information is. I wouldn't say that it was surprising or unpredictable. I thought it was likely that Wolfgang would be the first to die, and my only apprehension to suspecting Ava throughout the entire investigation was because I kept thinking that it would be a waste of her character to kill her this early. Part of the problem with trying to speak positively about a character-based mystery game is that part of the entertainment value of the first playthrough is the theory crafting and the expectations and anticipations. But I've kind of muted those appeals for myself over years of media consumption. Okay, for example, the investigation in this chapter, right? Obviously, I had no way of knowing what the writing style for actual murders would be like, because I've never seen these writers before, or how complex the case might be, and what kind of things they expect the audience to pay attention to. So, when Kai and Damon wake up late, I'm thinking the whole time there's probably a reason for that. Kai could have done something early in the morning or during the nighttime that somehow would have prevented Damon from waking up, snuck off, whatever, then gotten Damon up to go to the tournament at 9. So things like them not waking up in time, or Ingrid having a headache or something, Desmond not knowing that where the stun gun even came from, etc., all were apparently happenstance, which is fine. A mystery should probably have some red herrings that are purely happenstance, but I'm just trying to illustrate the difference between, the experience of predicting a mystery versus the experience of solving a mystery. Now, I have always considered this the weakest aspect, or one of the weakest aspects, of the DR games. Some of the cases in DR I think are cool because you can solve them yourself just based off the evidence before you even start the trial. But I think there's two kinds of mystery-solving games. Games where you only solve things piecemeal by basically playing a linear visual novel and answering very pointed questions at you that are basically guiding you to what the answer is. Games like Danganronpa, games like Ace Attorney, etc. And I'd also include games where it is a mystery story, but all you have to do is, as the audience, is just keep playing the game and they will eventually just tell you the answer. So mystery stories like the Zero Escape games, or 13 Sentinels, or Your Turn to Die, or whatever else, where the overall story has a mystery, and you can enjoy theory crafting while you're playing it, but basically you just won't know the answer until the game tells you the answer, and you're not really solving it through your own mystery-solving skills. And then there's other kind of mystery-solving games where you're really expected to holistically figure things out entirely by yourself. And then once you have proven that you have understood what happened just from your own analysis, you can input a more complex answer into the game systems and move on. Games like Case of the Golden Idol, or a couple other ones. Ace Attorney and Danganronpa and other adventure games of this nature operate in a sort of flux. Sometimes the next thing that you have to answer is very direct, very guided. Sometimes you have to do a little bit more assuming and mystery solving before you can figure out what the game wants from you. Those types of mysteries where they don't hold your hand step by step, but they just give you like a complex mesh of clues that are comprehensive enough that if you think hard enough and map it out yourself, you can reveal the solution, are obviously much more satisfying than just only being made to shoot down the next objective using a small selection of truth bullets. As a result, I may have had fun theory crafting during the investigation, at least a little bit of fun, and thinking of all the smaller things that happened that might be important, but I had much less fun during the actual trial. Especially given the fact that I didn't think that the logic for how characters reached the conclusions that they reached were necessarily compelling or convincing. Like, why couldn't Diana throw a lightweight battery? I don't think that's what happened, but they just insist that that's not something, and they're just saying something is arbitrarily not possible, and it seems nonsensical. Not to rehash my issues with the logic and the evidentiary soundness of their conclusions, but the point is, I never felt clever solving this mystery. I never had to use my brain in an interesting way. The only places where it might have been possible for the player, myself, to put more mental effort in, such as the overall reductive logic is realizing that Diana is the only person that did not have an accounted for alibi at that specific time. But I have an issue with that, which is when I was asked who did it, at that moment I had no idea that the game thought that I had all the information necessary, and once asked to select the character, there was no way for me to look at that information, because there was no way for me to access the dialogue log for me to see who they said already had an alibi, and it wasn't provided in the available truth bullets. And even if I were to open those menus, the timer is like 30 seconds, and it's still running down even when you're opening these menus to look at this information. So, like, off the top of my head, I remembered who was in the rooms in the basement, but I couldn't remember who all else was accounted for by other characters. I also wasn't sure if I could confirm or deny whether some of the characters could have been alone at a particular period of time, in between portions of their alibi. So because I had no way of viewing that information and critically thinking through it, and no menus I could access, I couldn't do the actual reasoning and the process of elimination in my head. I would have had to do that process of elimination before I was asked the question. And even if I could do more complex and involved puzzle solving, the trial mechanics basically demand that you answer most questions within 30 seconds, and looking at your evidence doesn't pause the timer. And there's no consequences for dying, obviously. You just, except for the one time that my game fucking soft-locked after a game over and I had to replay 10 minutes of gameplay, but I still felt like it expected me to memorize the evidence before being asked a question and not be able to look up anything or think hard about something after being asked a question. And that's fine, I guess. It's not usually how these games tend to work. Whenever you play Ace Attorney, you basically just click through the dialogue until you get to the next cross-examination, and then you start looking at the what people are saying, and then you look through your evidence, and that's when you start thinking. It just felt like even the game itself was discouraging most scenarios where I could sit down and think and solve something more complex than, like, a brief pop quiz. And a part of this is learned behavior and consistency. Like, I'm used to most of these types of games not requiring me to put even a little bit of thought or effort into a mystery until I'm actually at a point where the gameplay asks me a question. And after playing a million games in this genre, and I've gotten used to that. Like, I don't really theory craft while I play most mystery games anymore, especially because there's no way for me to know if I'm just fundamentally missing some piece of information that will just flat out simply be revealed later on. So the only time I know that my effort of thinking will be rewarded in any way is once I've reached the point where the game is actually asking me to answer a question. Games like Case of the Golden Idol and its sequel are just 5 million times better and more satisfying in how their mysteries work. And I've just become more jaded to the concept of theory crafting while playing a linear adventure game or a visual novel, because of how many of them just wind up having dumb plots that don't make much sense, for one, and also because I kind of reject the entire appeal of theory crafting these days. Like, after you play enough of these games, and so much surrounding mystery media storytelling, and also literary analysis, which I do for any movie or game that I'm playing, which also involves theory crafting, but it's on a metatextual level where I'm theory crafting what the thematic implications of something is or will be, and not about the plot necessarily. It's just kind of clear to me that the story will wind up being whatever it winds up being, and it's at the mercy of the writer and what they think is reasonable, and not whatever I think is reasonable. Anyways, this section was supposed to be about positives, right? Things I like about the chapter. Anyways, it's complicated. I liked the investigation in the moment, but enjoying theories based only on my own imagination is a complicated subject, you know? It's complicated because stuff like theory crafting, stuff like making memes and fan fiction about characters, and, like, it's all stuff that's manufactured by the players and not really created by the story. It's hard to explain to someone who's not coming from my perspective on this, but watching people talk so animatedly and excitedly about who might kill, who's gonna die or live, oh my god, oh, what if they use this to kill someone, what murder plot's gonna happen, and it's like, how do you, how do you care, you know? Like, what has the story done to make you care about if this character dies as opposed to that one in some chapter? The fans are generating their own personal investment and also their own entertainment out of what is ultimately just completely outside the scope of what the game itself has actually created. Some theories people might have are clearly prompted by the game itself, like prompted by red herrings or whatever else, or implications about foreshadowing about the future. I'm not the only one who thought that Kai and Damon waking up late was going to be important, right? But most of the insane shit that I saw people saying with absolutely zero evidence, is nothing in the story to prompt them to have these totally not off the walls theories, and then getting so excited about their made up scenarios, and it's like, at that point, I just see that as people having fun writing their own stories, like just enjoying the creative writing process, and I don't see that as the same thing as them enjoying something that the game itself has actually made and given them. I think it's interesting that no one came up to Damon with his secret in this chapter, and that they didn't talk about or even ask whose blackmail Wolfgang was given. Maybe they just didn't like Damon or didn't want to talk to him. Maybe it was vague in a way that implied something worse than it really was. Maybe his blackmail was a lie. Maybe they were just going to talk to Damon, but they didn't get around to it before the murder happened. Or maybe Damon actually does have a particularly scary secret for some reason that we're not aware of, or that he's not aware of. But then again, nobody was really acting suspicious of Damon in the trial or the investigation. We know that Kai and Ava didn't have his, etc. It's clear at least Wolfgang's secret will be coming back sometime in the future, and maybe we'll get Ava's secret and some other character or whatever's. But, okay, I think I need to clarify something, both in this video and also as a self-reflection. And it's a testament to how solid this whole chapter is that my impulse to be a contrarian asshole and criticize it full-throatedly is because, like, that means that it is good enough or consistent enough in my brain that I'm interpreting it as something normal, like an actual game that I'm judging in comparison to real games that were made with money and that cost actual money. My attitude in the prologue, however long ago that was not quite the same. I was coming to this project with, like, I thought it had some surprising legs to it, but I still felt like it was just like a fan thing, and that it's not fair to really judge it in comparison to actual productions. This chapter is undoubtedly a step up from the prologue in terms of overall narrative structure and completeness. So anything that I'm not feeling the need to comment on, it's probably because it was good enough that my brain did not perceive it as being less than a normal adventure game. And I'm pretty picky, so I do mean that as a strong compliment, okay? As you can probably tell, I'm quite pedantic about this shit. I've been fascinated by the choice of the game engine for Eden's Garden, since most fan games, even if they emulate the style of the DR games, they do so in, like, video uploads, or fucking RPG Maker games or whatever. I don't look at Your Turn to Die and find it to be a less competent game because it's made in RPG Maker. And it's not like I enjoy Eden's Gardens more or simply because it was made in, like, Unity or whatever they made it in. My actual thoughts about this project, my real feelings before anything to do with the game is, like, I do hope that this is a really strong experience for the development team to put in their portfolio or whatever if they want to have a career in making games or at least have it as a serious hobby. A thought that always occurs to me whenever I do research into this project, watch a bunch of streamers, watch a bunch of dev interviews, is that I always feel like the social narrative of Eden's Garden is so much more sweeping than the actual game itself. Like, I don't want to... I'm not saying that it's a competition, right? I'm not saying... I don't want to take anything away from the efforts of the people involved in making this project, but it always... my brain is impulse to be contrarian, so I'm always looking for, you know, a self-reflection for why things are the way they are. And it always tickles me when people on social media swarm around this project, specifically this project, as an example of, like, a grassroots amateur game development, when there are lots of indie games out just in the world that manage to do more with less, but they just don't really have, like, their faces out in public in quite the same way. Like, the PEG is a team comprised of mostly young amateurs, and that's, like, the most impressive part about it, making a decidedly fan project with no hope for monetization. And to my knowledge, there's no source of crowdfunding for this work, etc. But I also feel bad when I think about how this kind of attention, this sort of social media buzz and swarm and praise, doesn't really get directed towards some, like, I'm pretty sure Misericord is just made by one fucking guy in his mom's basement off a budget of instant ramen and used condoms. Still, having any budget at all obviously makes a huge difference, and I'm sure that the lone warriors who make Misericord, Your Turn to Die, Paper Lily, Being a Dick, whatever else, all have probably more experience under their belt to guide them through their process of making their games. And I'm not trying to say that any of these indie developers are, like, better than the PEG team, or make, I'm not saying that it's a competition. It's just interesting to me how and why a project like this generates more attention, like that, so much more attention, and thus so much more grace and social support and sympathy, based on nothing but how open the team and the development process is to the public. The game itself is inseparable from the concept of the team and how prominent they are in their public presence. Honestly, even if it's totally accidental, I see it as very smart, like a brilliant marketing tool for an amateur project. Now, of course I'm going to think more positively, or at least more sympathetically, about a project when I see the developers leaving comments on my fucking videos in my tiny little channel, right? More than anything, it makes me reflect on my harshness of my criticisms of projects that I don't know the development history of, and that I can't see the creators of. I don't know anything about them. It also made me think that it'd be unfair for me to give all this attention to PEG just because it went viral on social media, and not, and like, in the process, I'm probably overlooking a ton of other incredibly impressive works made by even smaller, less privileged development teams or whatever that I'm totally unaware of. And obviously that's just the creative process. There's always going to be things that are made by very impressive people that get overlooked, and, you know, what can you do about it? But, you know, I wanted to at least work the part, so I clicked on another relatively highly rated DR fan game on itch.io, and I played through that as well. Just to say that I did, I guess. So, ending thoughts. I have a bunch of games in my head, games and movies, that I think should be played and used as examples to learn from. I'll try to keep them in recent memory. I'm going to go ahead and single out Murders in the Yangtze River, like this Ace Attorney Professor Layton Danganronpa novel-inspired murder mystery adventure game. That's a game that's working within much more limitations. It has a small number of, art assets. The only thing that could be described as fancy is maybe the soundtrack. It has an extremely clever mystery setup, and it works under basically the same rules as Ace Attorney gameplay, or maybe Edgeworth Investigations gameplay. But it manages to expect more creative problem-solving from the player. It has a great relationship with making the physics of the universe make intuitive sense, a good relationship with scientific accuracy, and a good overarching story accentuated by smaller conflicts involved that are thematically resonant, thematically rich to the actual, and a likable main character that bounces off of the people he meets very well. You can get inspiration from any number of sources. Inspiration for murder mysteries, both as gripping stories like thrillers, but also as gameplay experiences for puzzle solving. I have personally never viewed DR's gameplay or mystery solving as its most important element, or even particularly a good part of it. And that's only become more true as time has gone on. I solved these cases decades ago, but I am still learning new things about the characters and the meta-narrative, etc. through retroactive analysis. I think it's important, for a mystery story to have both mysteries that you solve or understand actively as the story goes on, and then mysteries that you, the player, are left to your own devices to solve after you've already finished the story, or the chapter, or whatever segment you want. I also don't want to suggest that DR games are somehow perfect, or that emulating DR games more accurately will result in a better or more perfect game. I generally disagree with any attempt to copy something that already exists in body and or in spirit. One thing that worries me about playing through this Chapter 1 is the dynamic between Toshiko and Ingrid. I don't like it because it feels intentional and self-castrating to me. In an ideal world, I would like each character to have a recognizable relationship and rapport with each other character. I would like to take two characters and be able to competently explain what each of those characters thinks of each other and what their dynamic would be one-on-one or in a group setting or whatever. I get worried when I see obvious pairs forming in games like this because it makes me feel like it'll mostly be a small number of only specific characters chosen to have intentional dynamics with each other, and not a more natural thing where every character is considered deeply in how they might act or speak in different situations and off of other people's personalities. I look at Ingrid being closely associated with Toshiko a lot in this chapter and in the prologue, and I think, okay, so they're going to be involved in some storyline later where one or both of them die, and it'll try to have emotional stakes only because they had a relationship or connection forming together. I don't look at Toshiko and Ingrid and think that it's a good setup for interesting characterization for either of them. I look at it and think that it's just setting up the pieces for a by-the-books murder plot in a later chapter, where their relationship won't have been interesting at all, save for the fact that one of them died and the other will be sad about it. Obviously, I'm just talking about future hypotheticals, maybe none of that happens, but that's basically all I could think of every time it was obvious the story was putting those two characters together, especially considering the fact that they're together a lot in this first chapter, and not a single instance in this chapter of Ingrid and Toshiko interacting do they interact with each other in an interesting way. I can barely remember any words they said about each other or to each other. But that aside, yeah, I just think, okay, Core DR has a lot of different factors at play, and I think it's important to pick what appeals you're trying to hit, and hit them well. Like grim violence, complex mystery solving, both in the present, like proactive mystery solving and or retroactive mystery solving, interesting character drama, emotional stakes. What's most important? What experiences do you want the audience to be having during the fact, after the fact, whatever? In its current state, I'd describe this Chapter 1 and the prologue, for that matter, as technically sufficient, but it leaves me with nothing. to chew on and nothing to go back to. All there is right now is just room to come up with random, baseless, out-of-the-box theories for what might happen later on in the story, which as far as I'm concerned would just, again, be me writing my own fanfiction, and I can already do that myself. Now, this isn't necessarily a real flaw. Like I said earlier, it's totally unfair to judge this story based only on the section that has been finished. If you released if you only played the first chapter of a real DR game, chapter by chapter, and it was like a year between each chapter, that would also not work, okay? Those stories rely on you being able to continue the fucking game after each chapter. The feeling of only anticipating what will happen at the next stage in order to understand the truths of the plot and the truths of what themes and characterization and anything is trying to be hit wouldn't be an issue if we could just click on and keep playing into chapter 2. So that's a big caveat to everything that I'm saying. But it's also, like, the vast majority of the fan base for this project, they're not, like, uptight assholes like me, fucking wagging their finger about tonal dissonance. So I can only speak from my own personal opinion and nobody else's. But in my opinion, I think that regardless of how this product is supposed to be consumed or is meant to be consumed, as in, it'd obviously be better to play it once the whole thing is completely finished, the fact that it is being released and played chapter by chapter, and the total content, that is significant. This is like 10 hours plus bonus optional FTEs. There are plenty of indie games that are more solid products that have less overall content put into them. So the fact is, people like me, like, I can tell myself that it's unfair to judge this until it's a finished product, but when I play something, I obviously am not going to be able to stop myself from judging it as it is and what I am actively playing. So I just think working a bit more on the appeals that do not rely on future plot points to be revealed would be very beneficial to how it's going to be consumed. I'm personally not a really big believer in the appeal of anticipation in the first place, as I've already clarified. I would have loved to watch more streamers play through this just for the sake of due diligence to see what people are saying or thinking, but I just got bored after a bit because a lot of the scenes are just boring after you've already watched them for the first time. So, to wrap up, I want to clarify, I'm not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, but I know that me saying that does not make criticisms feel less bad to the person that's being criticized. I totally get that, okay? I've experienced that, I know that. I have listened to a bunch of the dev team in so many interviews by now, and I think that they are trying to push themselves to make this as good of a project as they possibly can, and I also think that the core audience for this type of project are not the sort of people that are going to even try to offer constructive criticism, so I don't think they get much criticism. I have actual criticism. I'm sure there's lots of random assholes that don't play the game that just offer 2-bit takes on Twitter. It's not what I'm talking about. Like, actual thorough criticism. I have no idea if this video would make the developers feel bad about their work, or if they would appreciate harsh feedback and take whatever they think is a reasonable criticism and try to incorporate it. I really don't know how they would take it. I am only making this video because I think that they might appreciate and want strict criticism, and if I am wrong, and if this just makes people feel bad about a thing that's just supposed to be fun and is like a non-profit hobbyist activity, then that is completely 100% my fault, and I would not have made this video at all if I expected that to be the case, that it's just a downer, that it only causes negative feelings. So, that's where I'm at. Anyways, that's about it. See ya.